last week I covered the death of Jordan Neely, who is a man who was terrorising people on the subway, was put into a chokehold by a passerby, a good Samaritan, who was on the same subway cart as him, aided by two other men, one of whom, just to be absolutely clear, was black. One of the people who was aiding him was black. And as a result of this altercation, ended up dying. Sadly, nobody wanted him to die. These people were just trying to make sure that he was no longer a threat to the other people on the subway cart. Immediately after, lots of word came out speaking about how, he was just a Michael Jackson impersonator. He was a sweet, tortured soul. He came from a very problematic and traumatic background. His mother was murdered by his stepfather, who, in rather brutal fashion, I've got to say, murdered her, strangled her, and then stuffed her into a suitcase.
Oh, God.
Yeah,
Really?
yes. Wow. No, in fact, I think it was a briefcase, is what the reporting I've seen have said.
Not much better, to be honest.
No, not much better at all. In fact, it's worse. A briefcase would be smaller.
Yes.
So
you've got all those filey bits at the top, so you would have... Yes.
Well, it's horrible.
Yes.
Either way. Obviously a tragedy. Nobody wanted any of this to happen. But people immediately became out for blood. They started to throw vigils for this man, Jordan Neely. They started to protest on the streets of New York, chanting Black Lives Matter. All the usual suspects came out. AOC came out, as she does, showing her incredible microwave brain, saying that this was a murder before she had any idea what was going on. And there's just more information has been coming out now, painting a portrait that we already had a lot of information painting this Jordan Neely bloke as somewhat of a dodgy character before all of this, before today. But a lot more information has come out since, just to show how much of deserving of sainthood this young, this young man was. And then there's been some other stuff that I'll get onto as we get onto it, as there have been some consequences of this, and it really wasn't looking good for the mainstream narratives and the mainstream media until, happily for them, what the mainstream media always wants to happen happened, which was a conveniently timed mass shooting happened in Texas. And they can pivot to that and the white supremacy that supposedly inspired it. So before I get into the full story there, I would like to point you to the website, because as Dan pointed out in the first segment, we are demonetized. We also do have now a donate tab where you can donate discrete amounts of money to us if you'd like to support us. But if you just want a membership, that'll give you access to all of the content that we've got on the website. They start out at £5 per month. And for instance, of the sorts of content that we put out, we've got this recent contemplations from Josh, where he's talking about IQ and questioning how accurate it is as a measure of intelligence. He goes through quite a lot here. I'm not entirely sure that personally I agree with everything that he's saying in here, although he is much more read up on the subject than I am. But he definitely puts forward a very unique and interesting perspective.
Well, that's what makes it interesting, because he puts across a challenging perspective.
He does put across a lot of the genuine problems that come with getting people to take IQ tests, just some of the issues like the fact that you can game these IQ tests. You can, if you understand pre-taking the test, what kind of questions are going to be coming up ahead, that could improve your IQ score in a way that's unnatural, so to speak. And also questions whether, the IQ point itself is measuring anything that's particularly useful. But that's
good video, that one.
Yeah, that's the video. You should check that out. And without any further ado, let's get into the rest of this. So this is the video that I did last week talking about this new civil rights martyr just dropped. I basically went over all of the information. So if you want a more in-depth discussion of that, please go and watch that video, and please watch it on Rumble, because they don't hate us like YouTube does, and Mr. Neil Mohan, who runs it right now. But as I said, there is an insane level of narrative shifting and copium going on. For instance, yesterday, Callum and I watched this clip. I don't know if you've seen this one.
No.
This is from the Majority Report, which is Sam Cedar's
it's not
show.
Not
Nothing that you would be interested in watching, let's be perfectly honest. Okay. But this woman makes the absurd and incredible claim that not wanting to feel threatened or be assaulted on the subway in New York is a bougie attitude. If you
hang on. Not wanting to be assaulted is a bourgeois attitude.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a demonstration of an aristocratic mindset, you could say.
So to be enlightened, you should want to be assaulted on the tube.
Or at least accept it. Not necessarily want it. You don't have to just want it, but you just have to accept it.
But if it happens, it happens.
If it happens, then sucks to be you.
And what if I'm standing by watching a mother and child being beaten on the tube? Should I just ignore that?
Well, the man doing the beating is probably undergoing a mental health crisis, and you should probably
be supportive of him.
Yes.
Perhaps give him money.
Probably. That might help.
Right, okay. I will remember that.
This might just be an aggressive sales tactic for the homeless.
Right.
is beating you for your money instead of asking for it. They're adapting.
Because I think the case in this, I mean, he wasn't, that Marine guy, Neely wasn't threatening him, was he? He was threatening
everybody on the subway carriage. He was having some kind of mental breakdown. He was talking about how he's not afraid to go to prison, which, judging by his track record that we'll get into, he certainly was not. Then he said, "I'm not afraid to die," took off his jacket and threw it to the ground in a very aggressive manner. And from the stories that we've heard of this man, people on the New York subway system were probably well aware of him. In fact, I saw a tweet, I've not included it on this, but I think it was Steve Saylor, if you're familiar with him. He pointed out from a New York Times article there was a point where it mentioned that he was apparently on a 50 scariest homeless people in New York list. So people in the city were very, very familiar with him, especially because he was so prominent as a Michael Jackson impersonator. And the mainstream media...
New York has a 50th scariest homeless people list that it maintains.
Apparently, I can only assume it's very democratic, where you all just vote for...
I used to subscribe to the 50th best wine bars, eateries and pubs on Upper Street in London.
Of course you did.
It never occurred to me to subscribe to the scariest homeless people one.
You're wearing that jumper with that shirt, talking with that accent. Of course you did. But we had AOC demonstrating her immense, girthy, wrinkly brain. Where she said Republicans keep blaming mass shootings on mental health, but then defend the killing of the mentally ill too. These are not contradictory statements.
No, not really.
No, they don't have to be contradicting each other. You can say mass shootings are blamed on mental health, and then if you don't do anything to help the mental health crisis, then if the mentally ill people assault you, then they might die.
Have you got that chart that I've seen on Twitter, the one which is where to find mentally ill people, and it used to be in asylums and then prisons and basically...
Oh, I've not seen that one, actually. Yeah. That sounds like a very interesting chart.
Because something happened in the US where they basically decided they were going to stop putting people in mental asylums, and they were just going to let them roam the street until they committed enough crime and then put them in jail instead.
That sounds fair.
Yes.
This is reparations. Then there was this New York Times article, which was actually very interesting, because at first I thought that this was going to be some kind of nonsense excusing it, and it starts off like that, because New York Times, it's been pointed out, have done this a lot recently. They'll start the first few paragraphs will be some woke nonsense, saying, "Oh, this really makes us think about interracial disparities and the systematic racism and all that," and then the rest of the article will just be going through the facts and explaining it in very matter-of-fact
Is
manner.
that because they have the stats that lefties only read the first paragraph?
That's probably true, actually.
Yeah.
So it starts off saying, their encounter, captured on video by another passenger, has once again revealed the deep fault lines in the way New Yorkers and Americans beyond view race, homelessness, crime, and how some people seem to be treated differently by the police. The veteran, Mr. Penny, who is the person who did apply the chokehold, who is white, was questioned by the police but has not been charged with a crime for killing Mr. Neely, who was black. And obviously the implication there is supposed to be, can you believe this definitely wouldn't happen to a black person, even if in the black person's situation who was applying the chokehold, it would have been justified, in the same way that I would argue that this was justified. And certainly if you watch the full video, which is now out, you can see that the initial reports that were put out there of him being held in a chokehold for 15 minutes don't appear to be true, and in fact they kept checking on him, and they put him into the recovery position as soon as they were done restraining him and making sure that he wasn't a threat to anybody else any longer. And once again, this is not just a case of a white lynching. This was a team effort by three men who came from multiple different racial backgrounds, because, shockingly enough, as far as I can tell, black people also don't want to be feeling threatened on the subway in New York.
Yeah, or have their wives or sisters or daughters threatened as well. You kind of want to save. I mean, this is a natural thing for a man to do, to step up when when there is a threat to the people around you. If you can step up, you will step up. It's rightfully so. It's just something that you do.
And if you're going to have all of these policies that make it so that the crazies roam the streets, like you say, and commit enough crimes, and then they get put in prison, well, if you're still in they're committing enough crimes position, and the people around this situation are recognising, the police aren't here, or the police aren't going to step up, they are eventually going to have to take matters into their own hands. That's how I see it, at least. They also ask, was this a citizen trying to stop someone from hurting others, or an overreaction to a common New York encounter with a person with mental illness? This is just common. In New York, this is perfectly common. Just continue to let yourselves be terrorised by people who should be in an institute.
To be fair, where that guy did go wrong is the only correct play here would have not been in New York in the first place.
This is true.
Yeah.
This is true. But then if New York ends up completely ghosting itself and just becomes a ghost town...
Well, in the last segment, we saw the stats on where people are moving, aren't we? People are just leaving...
But that does mean that all of a sudden, hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers will have to go somewhere else. And other cities and other places will have to deal with thousands of New Yorkers.
Well, we only want the ones who think that this sort of thing is bad to go elsewhere. The people who think that it's bourgeois and you should just accept.
Oh, they can stay.
They can stay.
That's fair.
Yeah.
And they also point out here, friends and family told the slain man's sunny and upbeat demeanour as he struggled after his mother's murder when he was a teenager. They're going through the narrative, etc., etc. But then we get to the part of the article where most liberals have already got their fill.
Yes.
And they switch off and they go, I am informed now. I can move on. Because it really does paint a picture, the rest of this article. Right. So they say, outreach workers noted that Mr. Neely heavily used K2, a powerful, unpredictable synthetic marijuana. And I've never done any synthetic drugs like that in my life, but from the people that I know who have come into contact with people who do those kinds of synthetic forms of marijuana, they're really bad and can kill you and will make you go completely crazy.
Forms of marijuana.
Yeah, that's because you don't want to come into contact with them. People who take them go on schizo outbursts and try and hurt people. That's why you don't. It's the same as...
This is what Peter Hitchens is always warning us about.
Yeah, it's true. In June 2019, an outreach worker noted that Mr. Neely had lost considerable weight and was sleeping upright, like some kind of vampire.
Like a horse.
Yeah. Around that time, he was reported to have banged on a booth agent's door and threatened to kill her, according to the worker's notes. Then he was gone. At some point, Mr. Neely became a client of Intensive Mobile Treatment Team, one of the squads of mental health clinicians who minister to people in streets and shelters. In March 2020, the team had Mr. Neely taken to Bellevue Hospital, where he was kept for a week, according to the homeless outreach records. It was not clear what contact the team had with him after that. In November 2021, his aggression seemed to peak when he punched a 67-year-old woman in the street on Lower East Side, the police said. The woman suffered severe facial injuries, including a broken nose, according to court documents. He was charged with assault and, awaiting the resolution of his case, spent 15 months in jail, though his family said the stint was shorter. He pleaded guilty on February 9th of this year, 2023, in a carefully planned strategy between the city and his lawyers to allow him to get treatment and stay out of prison, which is always the fun thing. They want to keep these people out of prison.
So he walked up to a 67-year-old woman and punched her so hard that it broke her nose, and the authorities are perfectly well aware of this, and they thought that the correct response was to get him back on the streets as soon as reasonably possible.
Yes, and this was one of 44 separate arrests.
Wow.
Which the news like to point out was mainly for doing things like jumping the turnstiles in the subway, but also included violent outbursts against elderly people.
To be fair, I did assume that he wasn't buying all of these tube tickets.
No.
Yes.
No, he was not. He was to go from court to live at a treatment facility in the Bronx and stay clean for 15 months. In return, his felony conviction would be reduced. He promised to take his medication and to avoid drugs and not leave the facility without permission.
Oh, well, if he's promised, then,
13 days later, he abandoned the facility.
Right.
Okay. The judge issued a warrant for his arrest, and then on April 8th, when outreach workers approached him in a subway car at the end of the line in Coney Island, he urinated in front of them. When an outreach worker went to call the police, according to the worker's notes, Mr. Neely said, "Just wait until they get here. I got something for you. Just wait and see." Officers arrived and ejected him from the train, unaware of his arrest warrant. This just seems like a series of failed... this is just a series of failure on the city's behalf, as far as I'm concerned, to keep the streets safe.
It really feels like the story could have easily have been that this thing didn't happen, and the following day he pushed somebody onto the track, or he killed an...
Oh, he tried to do that a number of times.
Oh, did he?
People found very quickly on Reddit a number of reports from people who'd been talking about him for the past 10 years almost, talking about how Michael Jackson impersonator normally is really nice. Today he went schizo and tried to assault me. Michael Jackson impersonator tried to threaten to murder me, tried to push me onto the tracks. I saw him hurt somebody. Right. I saw him just harassing an old lady, etc., etc. This has been going on for a long time. There's a reason he got 44 separate arrests.
So hang on, something that's just occurred to me.
And go on.
Isn't he supposed to be black?
Yes.
So how is he a Michael Jackson impersonator?
Excellent question. Now we're getting into the really, really important stuff.
We're getting into the deep lore of this one.
No, but this article, as thorough as it is, shockingly, after you get past the first few woke sentences, does miss out quite a bit, though. For instance, if we go to the next one, there was reports from if you scroll down, I just want to get the source right for us, John, thank you. New York Daily News. Like I said, they say 42 times. I had also heard 44. But they say on June 27th, 2019, he was arrested for punching a 64-year-old man in the face during a fight in a Greenwich village subway station. Excuse me. And
he tends to prefer fighting the older people, doesn't he?
Generally vulnerable people, because he doesn't have an age limit. It can be very young people as well. For instance, he was also busted in August 2015 for attempting a kidnapping when he was seen dragging a 7-year-old girl down an inward street. And this man was still on the streets. And people like AOC are going, oh, this is just a case of mental illness. We need to protect this poor baby.
This is the thing that I cannot get with the left, is that the people that they pick as their saints, why do they choose these people? I'll give you an example. I saw a video, and it genuinely outraged me. It was basically this older black guy, and I don't think he had a record or anything like that. I mean, he wasn't homeless. He was just this guy in one of the smaller cities, and his thing was that he walked around with a piece of wood and he whittled it. He carved things into it, and he had this like 2-inch blade, and he was always doing this, and he was perfectly harmless. Anyway, this police officer basically pulls up behind him, gets out behind him, orders him to drop the knife, and within about a second shoots him in the back. And that was a genuinely outrageous thing for a police officer to do against this completely harmless guy who was just whittling a bit of wood.
Yeah, that's terrible.
And yet the left did not pick up on that one at all. They didn't care. But that was a genuine thing that they could have picked up on, and the right would have been like, yeah, you're right, actually, that was entirely wrong. And of course the cop got off. But they don't pick guys like that. They don't pick the genuine cases where, police or whatever goes too far. They pick their heroes from these guys, who, from what you're telling me, is a total scumbag and a liability.
Seems so. Well, judging from what you said there, I just on the spot, I'm trying to think of two potential reasons why they would choose these types of people.
Yeah.
My first guess would be in a similar way to the way that Labour opened the floodgates for immigration in the UK for the reported, what was said was rub the right's face in immigration. I feel like this is a case of rub the right's face in degeneracy. These are your new heroes. These are the sorts of people. And also, if they do choose their martyrs in a way that everybody can agree, at the same time, the left and the right, so to speak, then you're not going to have the partisan combat. The left always want to be able to point to the right and say, you're racist.
So there needs to be friction in order for it to be a story, to generate the media discussion, in order to...
And to continue to promote the narrative.
Yeah, so to give it the oxygen for the fire to burn.
So that the right can turn around and say, well, obviously this guy was a scumbag. While it's sad that he died, it's not like he didn't do things that prompted the action that led to him dying. The left can turn around and go, you're racist, this is racial violence.
So as a result of this mechanism, all the left's heroes are nutters, basically.
Yes.
Right.
That's just off the top of my head. Yeah. That's a reason that I could give.
Actually. Yeah.
Yes, and interestingly, on the subject of the narrative being pushed, the USA Today, as noted in this article, had said at the time that he was they just reported on him as being a beloved subway performer who grew up in a family of musicians who want him to be remembered as a human being. Well, no one's disputing that he's a human being. We're just disputing that he was not a very good one.
Yes.
And may have put himself in a situation where something like this was going to happen. And certainly the people around him, the city and the politicians around him, put him in that situation. But the actual questions that people started to ask after this was the one that you just asked. Why is it that we always get these people shoved in our faces? And why is it always highlighting particular types of interracial violence when they want to promote these narratives, that being white on black? And somebody posted this meme. End Wokeness did, and
if we saw that one,
if we scroll down, Elon Musk himself replied to this, and then all of a sudden Elon Musk started to reply to a lot of these things. So End Wokeness put perspective is everything, with a graph showing the differences in interracial violent crime incidents in 2018, which shows that white on black was next to Hispanic on black, the lowest figure, while also highlighting that the media always point this out, which the graph also shows that black on white is also the overwhelming majority of interracial violent crime incidents. Elon responds to it, and then immediately the cope begins. The cope begins to flow. So if we go to the next
Well, I mean, two things on that. I mean, first of all, Elon Musk is, of course, an African-American himself. And the second point is, I mean, that chart is just interracial violence. I think black on black is by far the biggest.
Oh, yes, very much so. But if you're talking purely about interracial violence, at least in 2018, this graph seems to show, and they got the source from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and also I think there's FBI victimization surveys. There's plenty of ways that you can get this information. There's the CDC Wonder reports, I think, which show the deaths that have happened and then the cause of deaths, and then they'll give all of the figures related to that. They immediately came out with this cope thread. I say they because they are the regime that operate in tandem with one another.
Well, they're a hive mind anyway, aren't
the Stooges all come out. No, go back to this, because I wanted to address this. This is a Kareem Carr who presents himself as some statistician, some expert on data, etc. And the thread is just magnificent, because I just want to point out the various ways in which he tries to change the subject and obfuscate what's going on. So he says, this bar chart has attracted the attention of the richest man in the world. Let me walk you through how I would interpret it as a statistician and a human. So
it feels like he's setting himself up for failure here.
Well, yes, but if you're a normie who's not encountered this sort of stuff before, and you're still very susceptible to rhetoric, then you can fall for this, because immediately what he's saying, if you disagree with him, you're basically not a human.
Okay.
That's the implication that I get from there. And then he says later on, I'm sure this data is in many ways dubious, and the claim that the media exclusively focuses on white on black crime is untrue, but let's set that aside for now. So he's just poisoned the well immediately by saying, I'm not going to prove it, but this data is probably a lie, despite the fact the sources are right there. If you wanted to disprove it as a statistician, surely you should go into the sources that are provided on the graph and disprove it that way, but he didn't. As a statistician, instead, what he gives are clearly emotive arguments. For instance, saying, now I would suspect if the media did disproportionately focus on black and white crime, it would be because they have a good faith belief that the causal element in these particular incidents is anti-black racism, which suggests that if it is anti-black racism causing this, that immediately justifies the violence.
Yes, that's not a statistical argument.
No, that's a race-baiting argument, as far as I'm concerned. And then he asks, do we think that the primary cause of black on white crime in America is anti-white racism, or is it vastly more likely that it's because black Americans are disproportionately poor and white Americans are disproportionately rich? So because
how do you explain the black on black violence being even higher than the black on white violence?
Also, I love, once again, the implication that white people are rich, therefore deserve it.
It's a bit like the Joe Biden quote, isn't it? That black kids are just as good as rich kids or something like that.
No, I think he said black kids are just as smart as white kids, or so. Well, I think he tripped and said poor kids, and then went black.
Was it, yes.
Yeah. The chart does even more than that, he says. It sets up the harm of crime as harm done not just to the individual, but to their entire race. There's an argument for stop noticing patterns, do not think of any self-preservation, ignore what's happening right in front of your eyes.
I'm yet to hear a statistical argument.
You're not going to find one. Right. You're not going to find one. Framing all crime as a form of racial harm comes off as a white nationalist framing to me, and the presentation of this data leads the viewer down a merry path to white nationalist solutions. So, if you think too hard about this information, or if you notice what's going on, you're a racist. So once again, all of the argument that's being put forward here is just that you're a racist. And Elon Musk started to report to quote on more things, to respond to more things in the next one. This graph which is showing that what you said, the black on black violence rates versus the white on white violence rates, which shows that disproportionately white people kill themselves, whereas black people kill each other. And this came from if you just hover over that at there for me, please.
That's a bit small, that. I'm going to have to lean in.
Yeah, that graph was shown, was compiled by Data Hazard, who is a fantastic account on Twitter that everybody should follow. There you go, John. Nice one. Which all terrible things to happen, but it just shows the disparities in the way that these people die. And then he also...
the red bar is homicide.
The red bar is homicide, the blue bar is suicide.
Oh.
So
that's a bit striking, isn't it?
It really doesn't paint a nice picture.
No.
And then he also commented on this one as well, and I can't vouch for the maths in this, but everybody's heard the meme figure 1350, etc. In this video he claims that it's 1360 in reality, but I don't know if he's done the maths right. But Elon did still respond to this. He's basically just saying interesting on all of these. And I just want to explain as well, I think the best way of combating these rates doesn't come down to any kind of white supremacist, white nationalist solutions. I think the way of combating these rates of violence, interracial and intraracial, would be better policing. In a lot of the places where this happens, they basically
Yes.
make it illegal to do measures that are proven to work. As much as it can inconvenience some people, and as much as some people complain about it, until 2018, when New York City was doing the stop and search on people, it was demonstrably shown to reduce rates of violent crime.
But hang on. If these numbers actually are true, doesn't that completely fly in the face of what we were saying in the previous segment about, because the Californians are now giving reparations on the basis that blacks are being incarcerated more. But if there's more violent crime going on, then maybe it's not discrimination, it's just law enforcement.
Well, this is what they don't want you to notice.
Right.
And even then, we live in a time where certain races are obviously preferenced in terms of the way that the laws are applied to them. So my solution is not to preference particular races in the way that the law is applied. My preference for this is to just have the law applied equally, and then also do the things like stop and search, which were shown in the New York City.
So what you're promoting is
to reduce violent crime, because once again we know that most of the crime that goes on within these black communities affects other black people.
Yes.
So if you want to help those people in those communities who want to build a better life for themselves, you make them safer.
So what you're promoting is some form of rule of law and treating people as individuals.
Shockingly enough, yes.
Do you think America would go for that?
Not this America.
Right.
Certainly not the one that exists right now. Perhaps some states. But the federal government in America right now would not want to do anything like that. But don't worry, though. Even though Elon is noticing these things, he is still at heart an S-lib, because he tweeted this one out when Ian Miles Chong said, do you support illegal immigration? And everybody said no. And then Elon felt the need to say, but I think we should significantly increase legal immigration. No, Elon, I could go through all of the arguments about why that's bad, why that doesn't fix anything, why that we already have hundreds of thousands of legal immigrants coming into the country in the UK every single year, and it doesn't help anything.
I'm really not even sure what the comparative numbers are at this point.
No, it's absolutely ridiculous. But despite the fact that this was beginning to become the narrative,
yes,
thankfully for the mainstream media, some guy went and shot up an outlet mall in Texas so they could immediately pivot onto this. So
now I don't know this one, but I know what I do know is the media goes straight to it and then they drop it very quickly if the shooter isn't white. So hopefully
the shooter isn't white, but he is supposedly a white supremacist, so they can keep the narrative going. He was
okay,
if I get the name right, a 33-year-old Hispanic man called Mauricio Garcia, who went to a Dallas suburb on Saturday and opened fire at an outlet mall and killed at least 8 people, injured about 7 others.
God.
Terrible, obviously a horrible thing to happen, but sadly I just know that the people in the mainstream media were on some level happy for this to happen so that they could distract from some of the things that were being discussed otherwise, and they could immediately pivot back around to white supremacy, blah-de-blah-de-blah, systematic racism, white society. They say right now in this article, I think they are building the motive. Authorities had not released a motive, but the patch on the shooter's chest said RWDS, an initialism that stands for Right-Wing Death Squad. According to people familiar with the investigation, the phrase is popular among right-wing extremists, neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and while there is a great deal of evidence to analyse still, authorities have not reached any conclusions yet. Investigators are approaching the shooting as a possible hate crime. Biden ordered flags down at half-staff through Thursday in recognition of the shooting victims in a statement. What's the first thing that Biden and the Democrats are going to do in a situation like this, do you reckon?
Call for a ban on guns, perhaps?
Probably, yes. In fact, he expressed condolences for the victims and called on Republican members of Congress to support a bill banning assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, among other changes to gun laws. So, such a tragedy has happened. Hand over your guns, please. You want to protect yourself? Hand over your guns, please.
So, I think there's some potential merit for that. And actually, what Biden should do is he should lead by example, and he should make the White House a gun-free zone. He should order the Secret Service to hand over all their guns. And basically have no guns around him whenever he travels.
That would be very impressive. That
because,
would really be leading by example.
That would be leadership, that would be.
Certainly. And just for some interesting little tidbits at the bottom here, which I'm going to... which might be relevant in a minute. So on the suburban street where the gunman's parents live, because once again at this point they hadn't identified him, several of their neighbours described him as a quiet person who didn't seem to court trouble. He just seemed to be aloof, kind of disconnected, but he wasn't threatening, said Kevin Todd, who lives down the street. One neighbour said that she didn't know him well, but he would often honk his horn and wave when he drove past. The Garcia family had lived on the street for many years and were well-liked, neighbours said, adding that the gunman moved out of his parents' home earlier this year. And this may or may not be relevant as we go on, just because there is a lot of stuff going on right now in regards to who this man was and what his motivations were. I'm not against the idea that he was a Mexican Hispanic who was a white supremacist. I do think these ideologies can sweep up a lot of people who don't just necessarily have to be white, especially when in America, I believe that they often get counted as white people, the Mexicans and Hispanics and people of...
depending on the crime, presumably.
Yes, that can happen. So I'm not against the idea that he really was, a supporter of Hitler, an anti-Semite, and anything like that. But there are a lot of gaps and conveniences in the narrative which seem to be...
I suspect there wasn't a strong ideological underpinning. I don't think he'd done a lot of reading.
Well, perhaps he did. If we go to the next one, just to dispel some myths, this image was going around a lot, saying that this was the man who did it, Mauricio Garcia. If we scroll down, once again, community notes come really in handy now that they've been implemented onto Twitter. It points out that this mugshot included in the tweet is a different Mauricio Garcia from Dallas County. The man in the mugshot was arrested in 2022, is 35. The perpetrator of the shooting was 33. So this is not the same person. If you see if you see this image, it doesn't appear that this is the right person right now. But there is a big thread examining his social media, which wasn't on Twitter or Facebook, or any mainstream social media outlet, but was instead on a Russian social media website that nobody has ever heard of before and has no content restrictions. It's called Odnoklassnika.
I'm unfamiliar with that one.
Of this person, Arik Toler, who, if we hover over his name, we can see who this man is. John? He is a researcher and trainer for Bellingcat, who, as far as I'm aware and as far as I've read up on, receive a lot of money from organisations like the CIA and the EU. So this is immediately something to be wary of. But he says some of the interesting things that he notes in here. If we just scroll through this, John, just because we can see some of the imagery that is on here. He had a YouTube channel which had that smiley face with the Hitler tash.
Right.
He had this flak jacket by the looks of it. Keep scrolling down for me, John, please. He apparently had these tattoos. This is all apparently from his public profile. Very, very fresh, but at the same time, if those
had he joined a battalion in the Ukraine or something?
Perhaps, but obviously, depending on when the photos were taken, it might have been just taken right after. It doesn't have to be that the photo was taken and then immediately posted. Could be an old photo. Who knows? But if we scroll down a bit more, apparently these were all on there. He was a Timcast fan, Tim Pool fan, apparently, which doesn't seem to be related to much to do with all the rest of the right-wing death squad stuff, because Tim Pool famously is centrist. Scroll down a bit more for me, please, John. He was supposedly scouting the place out. He had pictures of all of these guns and a receipt for them. Keep scrolling for me, please. He had pictures of, Nazi imagery, etc., etc. And he just... here's his apartment as well. He says it's the same apartment that he posted back in December of 2022 on his OK page, because apparently there's a YouTube video of him revealing it. If we click on it, and once again, this might just be me thinking about it too much, but this is from the 26th of December 2022, which would seem to contradict what was said in the Washington Post about him having moved out earlier this year, but it could just be misremembering maybe on the person. But something to note, I thought. And he ends this by saying the Allen shooter was obviously a white supremacist neo-Nazi, basically announcing he was going to do a mass shooting for 4 months beforehand and planned his target weeks in advance, posted in his handwritten personal diary. Everything I've seen shows that the most textbook mass shooter I'll ever find, and tells you about it every step of the way. He'll be a reference point for decades on mass shooters because he shared it so much. And he adds one last thing at the bottom of this thread, John, if you wouldn't mind. Clicking on this and scrolling down. Yeah, here we go. Just that one. One last thing noticed by Jake Godin. The Allen shooter was a big fan of libs of TikTok and signed off one of his posts with Heil Hitler. Now, note that the start of this particular post just says this post was inspired by libs of TikTok. Very interesting and convenient thing to find. And Ian Milestrong and a number of other people have started to ask questions. And once again, I'm not against the idea that all of this is legit. It does just seem very, very suspicious to me that CIA-affiliated news organization would unearth all of this on a Russian social media website that nobody has ever heard of. And it's all just on there for everybody to see this whole time. And he also just happens to share things from Tim Pool.
Well, and he probably just did like something from Tim Pool. I mean, the thing with popular media is that it's popular and lots of people like it.
including crazies.
It doesn't have to be that every single person who likes a thing is, a good guy. I mean, you can get bad guys who like things that good guys like too. I mean, it happens.
I know, it's a big shot, but then you also get him just signing off, just saying, this post is inspired by libs of TikTok.
Again, it's one of the major Twitter accounts.
That's true, but it's a very convenient thing to just start a post with. As far as I'm concerned, it comes off a bit fishy to me. But once again, I'm not against the idea that all of this is legit, but there are these questions that Ian is asking, and he asks basically the same question that I did in the next one as well. And so we'll see more as it all comes out. We'll see what else happens in regards to this. But for the time being, obviously, it is a complete tragedy what's happened in Texas. And I do send hopes and prayers to everybody who's been affected down there, because that is an awful thing to happen to anyone. And that's all I've got for there.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast, The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium contents on the site, such as the Symposium series, this episode on the Politics of Aristotle, Part 2. If you'd like to find out what else is being put out, you can follow on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.